Okay, so let's get started. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the fifth out of six sessions on this series. Time's flying when we're having fun. I hope you're enjoying this. Hope you had a chance to read or maybe watch the play tonight, The Importance of Being Earnest. I watched a film version of it this afternoon. Really funny stuff. So we got a lot to cover, and Mark's we put a tech solution together that got Mark on with his phone. So there he is, and I'm going to turn it over to him. And as usual, comments, questions, put them in the Q&A, and I'll do the relaying.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Wilton Library, and thank you all for coming back. We're coming here tonight. I will say that I have taught the importance of being earnest many times in undergraduate college courses. It's one of my favorite plays to teach outside of Shakespeare, but I do not often have the occasion to teach it as one of a group of other British comedies, so I'm delighted to do this. I will tell you that when I taught full-time literature courses, I would begin my introduction to the study of literature with a little experiment with my students. I would put big letter X on the blackboard, and I would tell the college students at Trinity College or at NYU or Columbia or Yale, wherever I was teaching, they had 2 minutes on their own to write a list of all the things they knew that letter X could stand for. I gave them 2 minutes, and then I called time, and I asked how many of them had 40 on their list. Nobody. How many had 20? Very few. How many had 10? Maybe half of them. And it turns out that symbol X can be times, like multiplication. It can be by, which is different. A 2x4 index card doesn't ask you to do math. It can be unknown, like Malcolm X. It can be the X in Christmas. It can be the X in cross-country skiing. It can be the letter X. It can be the Roman numeral 10. It can be an X in bowling. It can be X in extra large and on and the X-axis. It can be at least 30 things that most people know. Why is it that college-educated students, bright students trying hard, can't get more than a handful in 2 minutes? Because they don't have context. The key to advanced learning, to college learning, to the kind of learning we do here is context. So I'm going to shift some context for you about this play. It was performed in 1895. That period in European culture was called fin de siècle, end of the century. Fin de siècle means the end of any century, but if a century is not named, it's the end of the 19th century. It's sometimes also called the decadent period, and people think that decadent means dirty or perverse. Here's the deal. By the 1880s and 90s, pre-modernism, artists, cultural leaders, intellectuals were beginning to worry that the world was running down. They started to worry that there wasn't an afterlife. They worried that the industrialization, I'll talk about England since we're talking about a play performed in England, an Irish author, but living in England. They worried that industrialization, urbanization, the loss of faith was making life not worth living. And you started to see the outcroppings of things like Dracula, about vampires in the 1890s. The Time Machine, which imagines H.G. Wells, a future where human beings are divided into the albino and ineffectual, and the underground and feral, two different races. You had Wilde's own picture of Dorian Gray, where the handsome and flamboyant young society man has a magnificent portrait painted of him, and he wishes that the portrait would grow old, and what he wishes is that he would stay as youthful and as handsome as the portrait. And he unwittingly makes a devil's bargain, and he not only stays young, but he realizes that he can do any kind of evil, dissolute living, sexually, with drugs and alcohol. He never changes, but he's horrified to see that the portrait, the picture, starts to show not only his physical ailments, but his moral ones. And until he finally is killed and dies and falls on the floor, the picture reverts to its pristine quality and he looks horrific. Writers are interested in the idea that by the end of the century, life seemed boring, and they started to reach out to things like fantasy. Alice in Wonderland was written in the 1860s and 70s. H.G. Wells, the Alan Quatermain Adventures into Africa, Tarzan, about the primitive being something different, the discovery of Africa as a place to write and talk about. It may seem that this is a weird introduction to this play, but this play is a classic example of a drawing room comedy. Drawing rooms, short for withdrawing, were the rooms where wealthy people entertained people, their guests, in a smaller version of their magnificent house. And in real drawing room comedies like this one, there are very few scenes outside the limitations of the drawing room. Here they're in a garden and other places, but this 3-act comedy, there's a 4-act version. If you read that instead, don't worry about that. It's almost the same. Part of what a drawing room comedy does is show how narrow, how cloistered, how claustrophobic, how petty these society people are. So a play like this, a drawing room comedy, is a comedy of manners, but it is even more rarefied, more socially conscious than a regular comedy of manners. Like School for Scandal, we have a wealthy ward. We have the generational issue of the stuffy people trying to rein in the younger people. But you notice that we talked the Twelfth Night, which will continue to be the high watermark of the series, is about romance. Actually has emotional, heartfelt, romantic love. And none of the other plays that we've read has had that. Some of the other comedies have had sexual love, or at least sexual desire. The striking thing about this play is it has neither romance nor sexual love. There's no erotic undertone to it. There's no romance in terms of sweet talking. Someone decides she wants to marry somebody named Earnest because the name sounds earnest. It's stupid. If this were a moral play, she would have to learn it's stupid and she would have to accept that she's marrying a guy named Jack. But it's not a moral play. It's a silly play for people who want to enjoy a silly play. It has a serious point that I'll get to. And so the world comes around, and by the end of the play, son of a gun, Jack's actual name is Earnest. Not only is that true, he finds it out in the library of his home because the military register, which has his father's Christian name, is in the building. It's like the Mickey Rooney line, let's put on the play right here in the barn. In a comedy of this kind, the world comes around to fulfill the wishes of people in it. Because they're good and moral and worthy? No, because it's fun. In the same way, the artificialness of having the 2 women, Gwendolyn and Cicely, both want to marry someone named Ernest. The artificialness that the A plot requires that Jack actually be named Ernest, which I just explained happens. But Algernon is the B plot, the younger brother. He only has to be christened Ernest. The idea that everything is reduced to the physical. The worry about being baptized is that you may get wet and get cold. People talk about things like, what's your history? And instead of talking about her background, Cicely's background, her people, where she was educated, where her family comes from, she gives her immunization. She gives her health history. And instead of Lady Bracknell saying, well, that's absurd, Lady Bracknell says, in my favorite line of the play, a life crowded with incident. That's a laugh out loud funny line. Lady Bracknell is not making a joke. These people are earnest. They're dead serious. But Wilde is saying these people are so trivial that they accept a health record as a credential for someone getting married, as if she were a breed of dog. It also explains why two people can speak at exactly the same time as the women do. It also explains why, when I quoted this line last time, when one of the women is looking for an explanation, she says, "The suspense is terrible. I hope it will last." They don't say that as a joke. What they mean is life is so boring that I hope this suspense continues, even though it's anxiety producing. So that's one dimension. Another dimension, another context, is that Oscar Wilde was one of the leading exponents of the art for art's sake movement, the aesthetic movement that's associated with Walter Pater, who wrote The Renaissance, or John Ruskin, the great art critic. The running down of the world, the sense that the world was decaying, that reality was difficult, and there was no post-reality heaven. George Algernon Swinburne wrote a poem called The Garden of Proserpine, and it has this stanza in it. From too much love of living, from hope and fear set free, we thank with brief thanksgiving whatever gods may be, that no life lives forever, that dead men rise up never, that even the weariest river winds somewhere safe to sea. That is, people wanted the end to be an end. They could no longer believe, as intelligent, modern English people, that Christ walked on water or raised people from the dead. They could not believe, honestly, in an afterlife. And so they started to focus on just resting, just having an end. It's a fact that when people died in 17th and 18th century novels, often the last time we saw them was when they were at a church or chapel service, or there was a funeral in a cemetery and the family was saying goodbye. That is, the farewell was on the brink of eternity. Some ritual, some funeral, some wake, some memorial service was the way we parted. But in the 19th century, when someone near and dear to the people who they were leaving behind died, the last time we saw them was in their deathbed. Camille, Little Nell, why would we leave them in a deathbed? Because there is no buffer of ritual or religion. They're dead. They leave the family, and that's it. The reason that's connected to the art for art's sake movement is that people like Ruskin and Pater and Wilde believe that a true artist could find a joy, an alternative reality in art, and that that art was at least as interesting as the life that it was leaving behind. And so at the beginning of the century, William Wordsworth and other romantics revolutionized the idea of decorum and the legitimate subject for writing great poetry. William Wordsworth said the key to writing poetry is for the poet to look into his heart. And he wrote an epic poem about the growth of his own mind. That is, he wrote a poem about how he became a poet. He tapped his own feelings. At mid-century, Walt Whitman wrote his long poem, 52 sections, called Song of Myself, in which he was urging every reader in the democracy that wasn't 100 years old yet to sing their own selves by looking into themselves and expressing their individuality. Shakespeare, Milton, Dante, Homer, none of those writers would have said the key to poetry is looking into your own heart. They would not have been that self-centered. I don't mean egotistic, I mean focusing on the self. And they would have thought that the way to be representative was to think broadly about life. There was a new narrowness, a new, you could call it egoism, in this idea that sincerity, being yourself, was itself art. Well, Oscar Wilde, God love him, his dates are 1857 to 1900. He died at 46, a broken man. If you don't know his history of being jailed for homosexuality, it's worth a quick read of his Wikipedia page. He said in response to Wordsworth saying that all artists have to do is tap into their own self, tell the truth. Wilde said famously, any idiot can tell the truth. You don't need an artist to tell the truth. You need an artist to lie beautifully. And so the birth of the art for art's sake movement was to argue that the imagined was superior to the real. And so he creates a play that's loaded with imagination, where when Algie wants the explanation for why the cigarette case has a different name on it, and he says, give me your explanation and please make it improbable. It's because improbability is fun. It's why we go to the theater. It's why what's written on the cigarette case seems more real than the person who's sitting in front of him. And what could be a better example of the play privileging the imagined over the real, that Jack is mistaken for a novel? Miss Chasuble, back 28 years ago when she left him in the train station, left the baby and took the manuscript as if he were interchangeable with a made-up story about a novel. Wilde is having a good time making the point that people prefer fiction to reality, especially if fiction is imaginative and reality is dull. They say in the play that in fiction, the good are rewarded and the wicked are punished. That's why we call it fiction. So it turns out that the play is really a celebration, not of the importance of being earnest, Wordsworth's idea of being yourself and being sincere, but the importance of being just the opposite, the importance of being inventive, of being imaginative. I'm going to use this word purposely, of being flamboyant. I know that's a word associated with gay lifestyle. Wilde dressed that way. He was known to be a homosexual to his many friends and intellectual colleagues, some people who were involved in his career, some people who knew him in London, where he was a fixture. He was one of the most impressive and famous personalities of the 1880s and 90s. He did a lecture tour of America in which he lectured about England. He came back to England and he lectured about America. And he was not subtle about acting like a gay man. But homosexuality was punishable by imprisonment in England at the time and for a good deal later, so he could not actually admit to it. But the idea that the man who writes this play is himself leading a double life gives it yet a third context. I've given you the context of the end of the century, the context of writing being more important, the imagined being more important than the factual. He's having a great laugh at the heterosexual, presumably stiff-necked, earnest people in the audience who don't realize that these are two young men who have created double lives for themselves. There is no hint of heterosexual passion in the play. I don't mean that the two characters are gay. I only mean that they're not rabidly heterosexual. And that's Wilde partly having a wink and a nod at people in the audience. The invalid friend is called Bunbury, which is only one stroke away from Bumberry. And you can all imagine what burying in the bum, the backside, might mean to a homosexual listener to the play. Wilde was having fun with earnest people in the audience and getting in under the radar. That's not what got him arrested. He got arrested because he challenged the father of his male lover and wound up suing that man for libel, lost the case. And since he lost the case, the only alternative was to say that he was in fact guilty of homosexual acts, which he was. He was in prison for 2 years. It broke his health and he never recovered. So when The Importance of Being Earnest is called a trivial play for serious people, it is a serious play in which the importance of being earnest is not what's important. And when Jack says at the end, I've now learned the importance of being earnest, earnest was one of those values that the 19th century prized in terms of being having a stiff upper lip, being serious. The whole notion of British earnestness was a Victorian ideal. The idea of being straight-laced, the idea that you had to have tablecloths in the Victorian period on tables that might have the Queen Anne desk legs, a curved leg. You had to have the tablecloth go down to the floor to cover up the legs of the tables so people would not have impure ideas about furniture. You had infants not able to walk that were wearing bloomers down to their ankles because it was thought improper, even for the father of the baby, to see the baby's naked leg. Wilde thought this was nonsense, and he's poking fun at the earnestness. But along the way, he writes a play with lovely wit, with lots of reversals about marriage, about life, about literature and art, and a play that I think is laugh out loud funny in more than one place. At the end, when the two couples pair up, which is not unprecedented in plays, in Midsummer Night's Dream, there are three couplings at the end. It turns out that the rector Chasuble and the former governess, now tutor, Miss Prism, are a couple. No indication that they were a couple. It's as if they're the two people left over besides Lady Bracknell, and they pair up. And the last scene is a tableau, which means the characters freeze on stage to underscore the artificialness of the scene. I know this is an odd reference, but if you know the show Family Feud, and some of you do, it begins with the families frozen as a tableau, and then they break into live action. This is the reverse. Everyone freezes to underscore the artificialness of what we've just seen. It is a brilliant play about brilliance, about how much imagination informs a life that would otherwise be stultifying, both because of Victorian morality and because of the loss of faith and the condition of England question, where the 1880s and 90s, people were starting to lose the sense of an afterlife or a better future. So that's a kind of whirlwind context, but I want to remind you, we talked about fin de siècle and decadence. We talked about writing and the primacy of the imagined over the real. And we've talked about how it keys into Wilde's own life, his belief in the importance of art, and his making hidden or not so hidden jokes about his own homosexuality. So a little bit of a whirlwind, but I'm sure that many of you don't need help in understanding what makes the play funny. So Michael, I'm going to stop there. That's about where I said, right? Half an hour or so. So I'm happy to take questions and comments. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, as I've been stressing the last few meetings, I'm always happy to hear how you found the play as a reading experience. Now, this play is not 100 years old. We're getting closer to our own time. And so you may find it more congenial. So Michael, I'll turn it over to you as MC.
Okay, Mark, thanks. All right, folks. Well, you can take your time and put some stuff in the Q&A. The one comment right off the bat, Mark, is from Susan, who says, Earnest was a Victorian code name or term for quote unquote queer.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't know if that developed after the play. That's the first time hearing this, but anyone seeing the play would know that earnest was one of those values that Victorians prized because it meant that they were in control of their own discipline and they were serious. It's that stiff upper lip that we associate with the battle in the Crimean War, the conquest of empire, that Brits were serious.
So someone is asking this question. Is it no problem that Gwendolyn and Ernest are first cousins?
Correct. For two reasons. One is This play is not about reality. This play is not about reality. You see, no one says anything that could be seen as romantic or heartfelt. When do they want to get married? On the 14th of February, a Hallmark card. It's empty-headed. I want to say again, if this were a true Victorian play, if this were a play written by Dickens or George Eliot, they would have to learn that you're stupid to want to marry a man just because of his name. You're silly to want to get married or engaged on the 14th of February. I would say that it probably wasn't a bar to people of a certain class. There's lots of inbreeding in those classes. But I'll say more broadly, and I don't mean it's not a good question, but no one's having sex when this play is over. This is not a play about sex. It's not even, there aren't even double entendres about having sex. There's nothing passionate or physical about it. The most physical thing is when Chasuble calls Miss Prism Letitia and hugs her. And by the way, her name, Miss Prism, is a pun on misprision, which is mistaken because she mistook a manuscript for a baby. Now think about that. She mistook a manuscript for a baby. It's laugh out loud funny, and it becomes only more interesting when you consider that Wilde saying that a novel might well be more interesting than a baby, especially to the person who wrote it. I'll make another comment. The whole point of lying is to have the power of controlling reality. When you lie and you say that you couldn't come to a party because you're sick, you know the truth and no one else does. If your lie turns out to be true, that's really unnerving because you lose the power of control. In the castle, Kafka's hero, quote unquote, anti-hero, K, Joseph K, capital letter K, lies on the way up to the top of a mountain that has a castle. And he tells the innkeeper halfway up that he was asked to come to the castle to do some work. And the innkeeper said, well, I serve as a gatekeeper. Give me your name. I'll call ahead. I'll send up ahead and I'll see if you're expected. And Kay sits down to have a drink or a meal, and he realizes the jig is up, that they're going to find out that he's lying. And the innkeeper comes back and says, yes, they were expecting you. Please go on up. That's horrifying. That's the idea of horror that you see in Kafka. If you lie and you fool them, you're in charge. If you lie and your lie turns out to be accepted as truth, and you didn't know that it was true, that's terrifying. That's what this play does. It turns out, not for terrifying reasons, but for comic reasons, the lie he's been telling all along has always been true. The world comes around to make Gwendolyn happy. The man she marries will actually be called Ernest.
So Gene's got a comment with a question. Best play ever, in my opinion. This may be off.
I'm with you. Not outside of Shakespeare, I wouldn't go that far, but outside of Shakespeare, best comedy I've ever read.
He says this may be off the wall and trivial, but I noted that there are no asides to the audience in this play, where there were many in the previous plays in the series. Is that at all meaningful?
Well, I do think that it's not following the regular conventions of most plays. So there's no subplot. You know, if he wanted to, he could have developed a hint that there's an ongoing relationship between Chasuble and Prism, but he doesn't. We could have had a backstory about Lady Bracknell, who some of you may know is often played by a male actor to emphasize how unfeminine she is. I think this play is not interested in the regular conventions of comedy, which at this point is a very old genre in the Western world. And Wilde is using puns and word plays and reversals. You know, the good are rewarded and the wicked are punished. That's why we call it comedy. This woman has lost her husband. She looks 20 years younger. Marriages are made in purgatory and so on. The idea that you have to be worried about being christened because you might get cold, completely ignoring that it's a sacred rite in the Anglican Church and so on.
Okay, so Susan's now saying, can you discuss the relationship between Wilde and Gilbert? This seems to have a very Gilbert and Sullivan feel.
Well, it does have a light opera kind of feel. First and foremost, it's very sophisticated wordplay. Not as sophisticated and as evident as in Gilbert and Sullivan, but there is that sense of light opera. When Lane, the manservant, is asked what he thinks of Algernon's playing, he says, "I didn't think it was polite to listen." So that's funny, especially when it's delivered in real time by a good actor, because of course the point of listening, of being in the presence of piano playing, is that you're listening to it. And it's not an issue of being polite when you listen or impolite to listen. When people play music, you listen, it's art. But Lane is so earnest, so much bound by his subservient role that he has to say, "I didn't think it was polite to listen to your playing." Again, if you see it in performance by really good actors, it's one thing to say, "I didn't think it was polite to ask," because it takes willpower and a conscious decision to ask a question of someone. But it takes no conscious decision and no willpower to listening to music that's playing in the home of the person you're serving as a butler. It's a very funny line, and there are many funny lines like that. So in that sense, it has some of Gilbert and Sullivan's absolute joy in the levity of life. Now, they are wickedly inventive in the way that they rhyme, and Wilde is at a disadvantage because he has to give realistic prose, but he still manages to pull off some very funny lines.
Okay, Amy's got a counter comment in a way. I was a bit disappointed in this play. I first read it and saw it performed in the 70s and loved it then. But when I read it again this week and watched two YouTube play performances, I found it kind of boring and not that funny. It was so verbal with no physical comedy, but maybe that's just my preference these days.
Yeah, well, one thing is if you know the play already, as you did, and if you've seen a very good production when you're younger, it's hard for a better production to come along. I mean, there are actors and there are actors. There are no places to do anything too inventive. It is not a physical comedy play. It's not a farce in that sense. The farce is in the language. You can do a lot with body language and facial expression. Lady Bracknell gets a lot of laughs, either from her lines or from the fact that she's so imperious. And of course, she's the older person. In medieval plays, they called the person who wouldn't let people have fun the denier of festivities. The role Malvolio plays, the ill-willed one, the Puritan in Twelfth Night. In many medieval plays, the person who kept getting in the way is the person who says, "No, don't do that. No, we're not going to drink." Toby Bell says to Malvolio, "Do you think because you're virtuous, we can't have any more cakes and ale?" There's some of that in Lady Bracknell, and she only softens when she realizes that Cicely is a good match because she's got money, and that's all that matters. But she has the most leeway to invest the actress's own personality. And if it's being played by a man, or if it's being played by a brilliant actress like Judi Dench or Dame Edith Evans, you can do a lot with that part. But this is all a long-winded answer to the comment that is not, I think, a counter comment. I think we change our opinions about what we think is good or funny, especially if we've seen it before. But there's a much more leeway in what Lady Bracknell can do with her role than any of the other characters. There's nothing interesting about Algernon and Jack, and even less interesting about Gwendolen and Cicely, who were given upper class female names. That is Cicely and Gwendolen. So I think it's all a matter of how much we can tolerate the sameness. I have to say that I know the play so well from having taught it so often. It's a little bit like watching a movie like The Godfather, which I admire, but I know by heart. So that may be part of it. It may be that it doesn't wear very well many decades later. It is a play that requires you to have fun with fun. And, there's only so much fun you can have.
So just picking up on you just made a bunch of comments about Lady Bracknell. So someone is asking, what do you think of that character being played by male actors?
So when you think about Wilde's point that artifice is more engaging than reality, of course, a play of a aristocrat, a dowager, is funnier than an actual dowager. And a play where that dowager is played by a male could be more funny than it being played by a woman. And a play in which a dowager is played by a man in a play written by a man who is a homosexual may be funnier yet. So if you remember that what he's going for is artifice, because what he's saying is to be imaginative, to be artful is more satisfying than to be sincere.
Got it. So now Liz is asking, what's all about the fuss about the food in the play? Algernon finishes the cucumber sandwiches he knows his aunt wants after refusing to share them with Jack. There's
Yeah,
also the weird tea cake and muffin discussion.
yeah,
Was this just banter?
yeah. It's trivial in life. What's more important to some people than good food? And what's a marker of people's silliness when people are arguing over food when there are more important things to be had? I give an example. I lost 2 nights ago my father-in-law at the age of 99. He had a great life and a peaceful death. I'm not trying to bring anybody down, but we all know that one of the things you do when your neighbor loses someone important to them, you make them food. You bring a casserole, you bring food to them. Turns out that that food is really a blessing. But we all know we've gone to parties after work, and there's dip and maybe an interesting salad and maybe even some pastries that were baked. There's food that you could have had at home. And you went out after work and maybe you drove half an hour to be with people you see too often. And it turns out this is a party and it's kind of trivial, and yet it's not. You know that evening between 7:30 and 9 o'clock, you're going to have food and conversation. It turns out that's important in a minor key. Algernon, the younger brother, the less serious brother than Jack, is somebody who is absolutely trivial. So he's going to hoard food and care about cucumber sandwiches. It's Wilde mocking the idea of rarefied life. He is not in favor of the artifice of social conventions. He's an artist. He's interested in people who use their imagination to invent a life, which is what novelists do and playwrights do. They create lives on paper, on the stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, here's an interesting question, which I thought it comes from Cliff, but I wonder about it also. Could Jack be lying in the scene when he finds his father's military name?
Well, I would say that that wouldn't be consistent with anything I've said about the play. It would be easily discoverable because there's the book. So I don't think that goes very far. I think the two-tier level of the play is Jack is the hero and he must actually be Earnest because Gwendolen has had this idea all along. So Cicely has gained the idea by a kind of contagion. Algernon is the younger brother, the B plot, And he doesn't have to actually be named Ernest. He just has to eventually be christened Ernest. So I don't think of that as working out.
Yeah.
There's a play, there's a short story by Sartre called The Wall, in which a character during the Spanish Civil War is caught by the enemy. He is told that if he doesn't reveal the whereabouts of the leader of this group, he will be held up against the wall on the side of a barn and shot at dawn. And he thinks to himself, if I knew where this guy was hiding, I would tell them in a minute. To save my life, I would tell them in a minute. But instead, he has an anxious sleep with bad dreams on the hay in the barn. And in his dream, he imagines that when they hold him against the wall for the firing squad in the morning, because he doesn't know where this guy is, the wall will just, the wall will just evaporate and he'll be saved. He gets up in the morning, they give him one more chance, and he lies. He says he's down the road about 2 miles or how many kilometers. There's a farmhouse, there's a truck parked on the side. He's hiding under the truck. They throw him back in the barn. They go down the road. They come back and they release him because the guy, the leader, was under that truck. Just dumb luck. Sartre is making a point about the existential randomness of life. You make up a lie and it turns out you saved your life by accident. That's a very serious lie. That's a comment by a philosopher post-World War I, World War II, about the meaninglessness of life. This play is about how you give life meaning with style, with imagination, with irony, with wit. It was Wilde who said to the American customs agent, I have nothing to declare but my genius. It was Wilde who was reported to say on his deathbed, either I or those curtains have to go.
So
A very inventive man.
So following on that, on the previous question, Gene is pointing out that in the movie version with Colin Firth, that's exactly what happens. He lies at the end, and we see the text in the book that says his father's name was Jack, but that film version took a lot of other liberties.
Yeah, well, I don't know what point you want to make. People muck things up. I am fond of seeing cover versions of works that I like for what they can do within the limits of the play's integrity, but it does not respect the integrity of a play if Jack does not actually turn out to be Ernest. It is important that he be Ernest in ways I've already explained more than once.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a good point because actually I thought about that because that's the film version I watched this afternoon, and it surprised me.
Yeah. I have seen very few live or film productions of The Importance of Being Earnest that I have thought are very good. I saw a graduate school production at the University of Wisconsin by their theater group, and that was excellent because they got the spirit of the play. The play is funnier if the characters don't think they're being funny, if they don't wait for a laugh line, and if Lady Bracknell is so consumed with her own pomposity that she's not playing to the crowd, she's just being herself. That's what makes it funny.
Got it. So Kate's got a comment in question. I'm just going to read it pretty closely because it's something that I didn't see or understand myself. So, can you tell us something about Wolfe's intent with the Grigsby episode, the full act that was cut from the play? I encountered this unexpected but witty fragment when I watched the BBC Joan Plowright video of the play, and I thought it added both humor and context.
I can't help you there. Who asked that question?
Kate.
Kate, it's an excellent question, and I'm not saying that formulaically, but I have not even looked at that fourth act fragment for 40 years, and I have taught the play so often as a text of the three acts that I cannot tell you. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. I think that film versions of novels, film versions of plays, including some that take poetic license, are wonderful. In the not very successful Leonardo DiCaprio um, version of The Great Gatsby, something that they designed in that movie was that Nick Carraway is in rehab, recovering from that riotous summer from excessive drinking, and he's writing the book we're reading as therapy for his riotous summer. That seems to me to be a brilliant conceit that captures the spirit of the novel. I did not think it was a very good movie version of the book, but I thought that was a brilliant conceit. In the same way, I did not think very highly of the Robert Redford version of Great Gatsby. He has a kind of stiffness that fits, but Mia Farrow's Daisy absolutely captured the empty-headed, fairy-like little girl quality of a woman who could cry over a cascade of colorful silk shirts. It was worth seeing that version of the movie for that scene. I also thought that Nick Carraway, played by Sam Waterston, was an excellent performance. So mainly when I see a cover version of a work that I have high respect for, there's some takeaway for me. But a really good performance of The Importance of Being Earnest would be those people playing their stiff, self-centered roles without any awareness that they're being funny or being seen.
Got it. Now, here's another question about a play that I don't know. Maybe you do. The person is asking, did you enjoy Tom Stoppard's use of Earnest in a play called Travesties?
So I want to say again, whoever's asking that, I'm old. I saw Travesties when it first came out, which I think was around 1932, something like that. No, it's a long time ago. I very much enjoyed the play, but I have never taught it. And one of the things that has been true for me for the last 50 years, if I've read a play, read a novel, read a poem, but never taught it, it's largely gone to me now. If I've taught it, I can talk about it. So I have no frame of reference for that.
Okay, well, that was the last comment in the box, at least at this point.
Well,
It's
I'll say something else if you don't mind.
I'm
So,
sorry?
um, there is a school of thought that when you're reading a literary work, the purport should be about the person who's writing it. So, an autobiography, you may remember that some years ago, James Fry wrote a story about his own drug addiction called A Million Little Pieces. He was on Oprah, it was an Oprah book selection. And then there was a scandal that he had lied about it. I remember thinking at the time, so someone who is a drug user has lied about his past and people are shocked. But he made it sound like it was a true story and it wasn't. And I think people like me who take memoir seriously would be disturbed by that. But people who study memoir and literary critics who talk about the literary craft of memoir talk about you have two ways of assessing someone's believability when you read a work in which someone says, this is a true story. I think of Philip Roth's excellent memoir about his father's final months called Patrimony. If you've never read Patrimony, a thin memoir by Philip Roth, one of the best things he's ever written, I thought, please read it. I think you'll enjoy it, especially if you have connections to Judaism, to New Jersey, to relationships to older generations, and so on. But literary critics say there are two ways you can test the factuality of a book that you're reading that purports to be true. One is what they called authenticity. So you're reading someone's account of living through the Blitz in the Second World War in London, and you had that experience yourself. Or you have the letters or diaries of your grandfather who recounts his experience, and you have some kind of litmus test where you can say, this sounds authentic to me because I have reference, I have access to something like this. Maybe they didn't live through the London Blitz. Maybe they lived in war-torn Berlin. Whatever, you have a way to gauge it. So one is authenticity. The other much more common test, because we can't all have lived through, thankfully, war-torn Europe, is what they call sincerity. The style of the person's prose makes you believe they're telling the truth in the same way that everyone in this room, Michael, how many people are here tonight?
A little over 40.
That's a good number. Everyone in this room has had the experience where someone has told you something that's perfectly credible, but you do not trust them because you have history with them and they're not trustworthy. And someone else has told you something that is absolutely unbelievable, but you believe it because you trust them. The other test is not authenticity, not knowing the event, not knowing the time period, but knowing the teller. And you're convinced that this person is being sincere. They are telling the truth. That's a much more common test. And there is a very good book by Lionel Trilling, the great literary critic out of Columbia, called Authenticity and Sincerity, or the other way around, that makes this point with examples. It's a very good example of the different ways we test reality. I think I have very often encountered being convinced by someone who strikes me as sincere, even though I have no access to what they're talking about.
I was just looking up something that I remembered from this afternoon, since it involves a couple of key words you just used. There's a line in the play where uh, where Gwendolyn says, "In matters of grave importance, style, not sincerity, is the vital thing." I thought that was very
Right,
funny.
right. So I will say this to you. So when I was a teacher as a graduate student, a teaching fellow in Columbia at Columbia, the woman who was the trainer of the teaching fellows like me, who are going to teach in the School of General Studies for people entering college at older than the usual age of college first year students. Even if you were out for 1 year between high school and college, you went to the School of General Studies, but many people were working people in their 30s and 40s coming to college for the first time. And most of my colleagues chose Yale College, Columbia College, because they wanted to teach students who had been students all of their lives. And I asked for the School of General Studies. I was in the minority because I reasoned I would be teaching teenagers and 20-year-olds for the rest of my life. Little did I know I'd be teaching people like you, who I know are somewhat older. I chose the School of General Studies, and I love doing that. And one of the things about that was that you got to talk to people about the different ways you could test the reality of what you were reading. What is it about this work that seemed to you real? And we were asked to pay attention. One of the days of our training in Columbia College back in the 70s was the dean of students came in and said, we have found over generations of teaching that first year students in composition courses also often unintentionally reveal the difficulties they're having, maybe in getting used to college, maybe they brought this problem with them in their essays. And he said, without any attempt at humor, if you assign how I spent my summer vacation, he knew that was a crotchety, old-fashioned, dusty topic. And you find a student who's only writing about black spiders. And then the next assignment, who's an impressive person you've met? And that person is only writing about black spiders. He said, discreetly, let me know about that person. And it really impressed me that as a young teacher, eager to teach literature and writing, it never occurred to me that good students might be troubled to the point where their writing would be suffused with a kind of illness. And it turns out writing can carry a lot of weight in different ways. It can be very revealing of the person who's writing. I had a friend and colleague at Trinity College, now deceased, named Fred Feil, Pfeil. If you can find his short stories online, I recommend them to you. Someone asked him when he was applying for the job there that he got as resident writer, do you think that every character you write has some part of you in it? He said, absolutely. I don't think anyone is so good at making stuff up they can completely get away from their own personality. And a young woman, I remember she was sitting right next to me, I later had her as a student, said, what if you tried really hard to write a character who was nothing like you? What do you think that person would be like? I think that person would be like my twin brother, he said. That is, that the more you try to make them not you, the more they be you. I only say that because even people who are writing it don't always know, don't have that kind of intentionality. And I've always admired writers who have said on an interview show, when they don't know the answer to what something means and someone suggests, do you think it could be this? I've always admired the generosity where they say, yeah, I think that might be possible. So did Wilde mean to reveal as much about his closeted identity as he did? Did he do it as a kind of dare? It's possible. I mean, he sued a man in court for liable for calling him a homosexual when he not only was, but dozens of people knew it. And the man he was suing was a lord. There was no way to win. And even when it was suggested by the man he was suing, Oscar let it go, he wouldn't. So who knows? My advice always is when you're trying to think, could this mean that? Could this mean that? Is keep an open mind, be open to possibilities, and then when you have to decide, be as strict as you can within the limits of common sense. If it could be this, it doesn't mean it is this. Maybe it might be, and maybe not. But he's a brilliant man, a real wit, up with Mark Twain as one of the funniest men. If you want to have a good time, read in a online quotation collection, comments by Mark Twain or Oscar Wilde. Are we at the top of the hour?
Yeah, we just got there just now.
So I'll just tell you that one of the funniest lines, I'm going to give credit now to Mark Twain, is Mark Twain said at a speech that he was so good looking as a young man. Some of you have heard me say this before, that in the rainy season in San Francisco, he was walking down the street and was mistaken for fair weather. That's a good looking man. So I want to wish you all, Michael, what's our next date?
2 weeks from today. So today's the 7th, so 21st.
So that's before Thanksgiving. So I won't wish you a happy Thanksgiving. I hope you had a good Halloween. I hope you're enjoying this unusual weather. And I want to thank Michael again for this continuing invitation. I hope to correct my problem, which has me on Zoom, but not on my computer. I thank Michael for his patience in putting up with my technological difficulties. And once again, thanks to the Wilton Library and to all of you for coming. Stay well.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And thanks, everybody, for attending. Hope you enjoyed this. It was very interesting. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks. And
Noise is off.
Noise is off in 2 weeks.
Right. And that title means the noises that are being made off stage. So that's a direction of play that lets you know that there's some ruckus. It could be real noise. It could be murmuring. That's a reference. And of course, the play, if you know it at all, is about what's happening off stage, about the focus of the play is on the offstage action. Again, good night and thank you all.
Great. Good night, everybody. See you in a couple weeks.